Hi, I'm Saidel-Baker, an economist at ITR Economics, and I'm very excited to talk to you today a little bit about the consumer side of the economy. It's a rather large sector of our economic activity. In fact, consumer spending makes up about 2/3 of gross domestic product, or GDP. So it's a major driver in U.S. economic activity. And it's something that's getting a lot of attention right now with COVID and the closures, and quite rightfully so. Despite the sensationalized news stories and perhaps even common judgment, the consumer actually isn't doing all of that bad. Now, for sure, there is some pain on the consumer side, but it's better than it could have been. I'd like to think back to 2006 and compare the state of our consumer today to when we were, going into another downturn. To be quite frank, if our consumer was in the same health today that they were in 2006, you and I would be having a very different discussion on the impacts of this recession. Think back to February, before COVID really got its grips on the US and caused all of this disruption. Back then, the unemployment rate was historically low, incredibly low. Think how hard it was to be hiring back in February. As a result of that, wages were rising, so that means more people were working, making more money. In fact, our debt levels were quite low, and the quality of that debt was certainly much higher than it's been historically. We were even saving more money. In 2006, the savings rate averaged only 3.9% compared to 7.9% in 2019. So we came into this recession in a relatively stable position with relatively robust consumer health. That's providing a bit of a cushion now. Despite all of the pain, despite what's happening, this pandemic really came from outside the world of economics. So it's good that our consumer came in with a bit of strength and a bit more stability than in, let's say, 2006. Now, I know there is some pain on the consumer side. There have been job losses, layoffs, furloughs, etc., and that is a problem for some people. I can't ignore that fact. But overall, in the aggregate, you might be surprised to know that incomes actually rose in April compared to April of 2019. So even in really one of the worst months, when we were feeling that first full effect of the pandemic and of the closures, Americans actually made more money. That was due, of course, in part to the increased unemployment benefits. It was certainly aided by that $1,200 stimulus check that everyone received. And yes, some of those factors won't repeat and may or may not be reoccurring in the future, such as the unemployment, whether that's extended or not. But overall, I think it's very notable that despite the job losses, despite the really scary levels of unemployment that we see quoted, people actually did make more money in April. Now, not all of that additional income went directly to additional consumer spending, but not for the reason that many think. Personal savings rates really spiked in the late spring, early summer timeframe. In fact, rose as high as 33% of disposable income. That is a huge number. That blew away the old record from the 1970s of around 18% of savings. But that wasn't all intentional. Part of the problem was that consumers, they were stuck in their houses. They couldn't go out and spend that money. The bars were closed, restaurants, retail establishments were all shut down, so they just couldn't spend the additional money in their pocket. Now, some of that forced savings will be a further support going forward, and it certainly is good for the consumer to have that dry powder at their discretion. And the opportunity to spend will absolutely return in the future. That's part of our forecast for the consumer side to have a more robust recovery than something like the industrial sector of the economy or the manufacturing side, for example. My favorite metaphor for the consumer is that of an engine. And in a way, it's a very apt metaphor. The US consumer is very much an engine of economic growth in this country. So if we think of them as the engine, back in 2006, that engine was just broken. It was fundamentally broken down, the gears weren't working, it was seized up. That engine just wasn't going to turn over. Now, however, the engine, maybe it's just out of gas. It still fundamentally works. Once that engine is allowed back out of its house, once it has the opportunity to go out, we just need to fuel up the tank, turn the key, and that engine's going to be back in business. I hope this offers just a little bit of a glimmer of hope, and furthermore warns, don't overreact to those singular data points. We are certainly due for many more, especially on the consumer side in the coming weeks and months. There will be sensationalized news stories, but your job is to keep your eye on the big picture, because that's how your management should be judged. I'm Saidel-Baker. Thank you for joining me today.